Novikov went by himself to visit Makarov, the commander of the 3rd Brigade, and a favourite of his. They walked together towards a lake. One of the battalions was disposed on its shores. Makarov, a man with a pale face and improbably sad eyes for the commander of a brigade of heavy tanks, said, "Comrade Colonel, do you remember how the Germans chased us through that bog in Byelarussia?" Novikov did indeed remember. He thought for a moment of Karpov and Byalov. It obviously wasn't just a matter of experience, but of a man's nature. You can give a man all the experience in the world, but you can't change his nature. It was no good trying to make a sapper out of a fighter pilot. Not everyone can be like Makarov, equally competent, both in attack and in defence. Getmanov had said that he had been made for party work. Well, Makarov was a soldier, and he would always remain a soldier. That was his nature. Novikov didn't need to hear any reports from Makarov. What he wanted was to talk things over with him, to ask for his advice. During the offensive, how could they liaise most effectively with the infantry, the motorised infantry, the sappers, and the self-propelled guns? Did they agree as to the possible actions of the enemy after the beginning of the offensive? Did they have the same opinion of the strength of his anti-tank defences? Were the lines of deployment correctly drawn? They came to a shallow ravine that housed the battalion command post. Fatov, the battalion commander, was taken aback to see such important visitors. His bunker seemed somehow inadequate. A soldier had just used gunpowder to light the stove, and it smelt vile. "Comrades," said Novikov, "I want you to remember one thing. This corps will be assigned a crucial role in the coming engagements. I shall assign the most difficult part of this role to you, Makarov, and I have a feeling you'll assign the most difficult part of your role to Fatov. You'll have to solve your problems yourselves. I won't go foisting my own ideas on you in battle." He then asked Fatov about his liaison with Regimental HQ and with his squadron commanders, about the functioning of the radio, his supplies of ammunition, the quality of the fuel and the condition of the engines. Before saying goodbye, Novikov asked, "Are you ready, Makarov?" "Not quite, Comrade Colonel." "Will 3 days be enough for you?" "Yes, Comrade Colonel." On the way back, Novikov said to his driver, "Well, Karitanov, Makarov seems to be on top of things, doesn't he?" Karitanov glanced at Novikov. "Yes, Comrade Colonel, absolutely on top of things. The brigade quartermasters got dead drunk and went off to bed, leaving everything locked up. Someone came to pick up the rations for his battalion and found no one at home, and a sergeant major told me that his squadron commander got hold of his squadron's vodka ration and had himself a birthday party. He got through the whole lot, and I wanted to repair an inner tube and get a spare wheel off them. They didn't even have any glue." Udobnov was delighted when, looking out of the window, he saw Novikov's jeep arrive in a cloud of dust. He had felt like this once when he was a child. His parents were going out and he had been full of excitement at the thought of being left alone in the house. And then, as soon as the door closed, he had felt terrified. He had seen thieves in every corner. He had been afraid the house would catch fire. He had paced back and forth between the door and the window, listening, wondering if he could smell smoke. Alone in the hut that served as Corps HQ, he had felt helpless. His usual ways of controlling the world had become suddenly ineffectual. What if the enemy appeared? After all, they were only 60 kilometres from the front line. What would he do then? It would be no good threatening to dismiss them from their posts, or accusing them of conspiring with enemies of the people. How could he stop their tanks? Udobnov was struck by something blindingly obvious. Here at the front, the terrible rage of the state, before which millions of people bowed down and trembled, was of no effect. The Germans didn't have to fill in questionnaires. They didn't have to stand up at meetings and relate their biographies. They weren't afraid to admit the nature of their parents' occupations before 1917. His own fate and the fate of his children, everything he loved and would be unable to live without, was no longer under the protection of the great, terrible and beloved state. For the first time, he thought of Novikov with a mixture of warmth and timidity. "Makarov, Comrade General! Makarov's the man," said Novikov as he came in. "He'll be able to make quick decisions in any circumstances. Bylov will just tear on ahead without looking back. That's all he understands. And as for Karpov, he's a real slow coach. He'll need a good kick up the arse." "Yes, Carters decide everything. Comrade Stalin has taught us to study them tirelessly," said Newbodnov. "I keep thinking there must be a German agent in the village," he went on in a more lively tone of voice. "The swine must have given our position away to the German bombers." Newdobnov told Novikov what had happened in his absence. "Our neighbours and the commanders of the reinforcements are coming round to say hello, just to introduce themselves." "No, a pity Getmanov won't be here," said Novikov. "I wonder why they wanted him at the front HQ." They agreed to have lunch together. Novikov went off to his billet to wash and change his dust-covered tunic. The wide village street was almost completely deserted. There was just one old man, the owner of the hut where Getmanov was billeted, standing by the bomb crater. Holding his hands wide apart, he seemed to be measuring something, as though this crater had been dug for some purpose of his own. As he came up to him, Novikov asked, "What are you doing, father? Casting spells?" The old man saluted. "Comrade, Commander, I was taken prisoner by the Germans in 1915. There was one woman I worked for there." He pointed first to the pit and then to the sky and winked. "And I wondered if it wasn't my son, the little rascal, flying by to pay me a visit." Novikov burst out laughing. "You old devil!" He glanced at Getmanov's shuttered windows, nodded at the sentry by the porch, and suddenly thought anxiously, "What the hell's Getmanov doing at HQ? What fish is he frying now? That hypocrite. He gives Bylov a dressing down for immoral behaviour and then freezes up as soon as I even mention his Tamara." But all this was soon forgotten. Novikov wasn't a suspicious nature. He turned a corner and saw several dozen young lads sitting on a patch of grass. They were obviously new recruits, having a rest by the well on their way to the district military commissariat. The soldier in charge had covered his face with his forage cap and gone to sleep. Beside him lay a heap of packs and bundles. They must have walked quite a distance over the steppe. Some of them had blisters and had taken off their shoes. They hadn't had their hair cut yet, and from a distance they looked like village schoolboys having a rest during the break between lessons. Their thin faces and necks, their long light brown hair, their patched clothes, evidently fashioned from trousers and jackets that had belonged to their fathers before them, all this belonged to the world of childhood. Some of them were playing an old game he himself had once played, throwing 5-kopeck bits into a little hole in the ground, narrowing their eyes as they took aim. The rest were just watching. Everything about them was childish, except for their sad, anxious eyes. They caught sight of Novikov and glanced at the still sleeping soldier. They seemed to want to ask if it was all right to go on playing games while an important officer went by. "It's all right, my warriors, carry on," said Novikov softly. He walked past with a wave of the hand. He was taken aback by the heart-rending pity they aroused in him, their thin little faces, their staring eyes. The shabbiness of their clothes had suddenly reminded him that the men under his command were also mere children. Normally in the army all this was covered over by the shell of discipline, by the squeak of boots, by words and movements that were polished and automatic. Here it was transparent. Novikov arrived at his billet. Strangely, this meeting with the new recruits troubled him more than all the other thoughts, impressions and anxieties of the day. "Men," he kept repeating to himself. "Men, men." All his life as a soldier, he'd been afraid of having to account for lost ammunition and ordnance, lost fuel, lost time, afraid of having to explain why he'd abandoned a summit or crossroads without permission. Not once had he known a superior officer show real anger because an operation had been wasteful in terms of human lives. He'd even known officers send their men under fire simply to avoid the anger of their superiors, to be able to throw up their hands and say, "What could I do? I lost half my men, but I was unable to reach the objective." Men, men. He'd also seen officers send their men under fire out of pure obstinacy and bravado, not even for the sake of covering themselves by formal compliance with an order. That was the mystery and tragedy of war, that one man should have the right to send another to his death. And this right rested on the assumption that men were only exposed to fire for the sake of a common cause. Yet one officer Novikov had known, a sober and level-headed man, had been used to having fresh milk for breakfast. He'd been posted to an observation post in the front line, and a soldier from a support unit had had to bring him a thermos every morning, exposing himself to enemy fire on the way. There had been days when the soldier had been picked off by the Germans, and the officer had to do without his milk. On the following day the milk would be brought by another orderly. And the man who drank this milk was both good-natured and fair-minded. He showed great concern for the well-being of his subordinates. His soldiers referred to him as father. How could one ever make sense of all this? Soon Neudobnov arrived. Hurriedly and painstakingly combing his hair, Novikov said, "War's a terrible business, Comrade General. Did you see those new recruits?" "Yes, they're a green lot. Second-rate material. I woke that soldier up and promised to send him to a penal battalion. Never seen such slovenliness. It looked more like a tavern than a military unit." In his novels, Turgenev often describes calls paid by neighbours on a landlord who's just settled down on his estate. And that evening 2 jeeps stopped outside Corps HQ, and the hosts came out into the porch to receive their guests. The commanders of an artillery division, a howitzer regiment, and a rocket launcher brigade. Take my hand, dear reader. Today is the name day of Tatiana Borisovna, and we must go to pay her a visit. Colonel Morozov was the commander of an artillery division. Novikov had heard of him several times. He'd had a clear picture of him in his mind, someone red-faced and round-headed. In fact, he was a middle-aged man with a pronounced stoop. His bright eyes seemed to have nothing to do with his sullen face. It was as though they'd been placed there by mere chance. Sometimes, however, their quick, laughing intelligence made it seem as though they were the true expression of the colonel's being. And then it was the wrinkles, the despondent stoop, that seemed the chance appendage. Lopatin, the commander of the howitzer regiment, could have been Morozov's son, or even his grandson. Majid, the commander of the Katyusha rocket launchers, was very swarthy. He had a high, prematurely balding forehead and a black moustache on his protruding upper lip. He seemed witty and talkative. Novikov invited his guests to come through. The table had already been laid. "Greetings from the Urals," he said, pointing to some plates of pickled and marinated mushrooms. The cook had been standing beside the table in a theatrical pose. He suddenly went bright red, gasped, left the room. The tension had proved too much for him. Bershkov took Novikov aside, pointed at the table, and whispered something in his ear. "Oh, yes, of course," said Novikov. "Why keep vodka locked up in a cupboard?" Morozov held his fingernail against his glass a quarter of the way up and explained, "I can't have any more because of my liver." "How about you, Lieutenant Colonel?" "Oh, fill it right up. My liver's doing fine, thank you." "Ah, Majid's a true Cossack. Now, how about you, Major? How's your liver?" Lopatin covered his glass with one hand. "Oh, thank you, but I don't drink." Then he took his hand away and added, "Well, a symbolic drop. For the toast." "Lopatin's a baby. He just likes sweets." They drank to the success of their common task. Then, as always happens, they discovered they had friends in common from their days at military school or the academy. They went on to talk about their superior officers, about how cold and unpleasant the steppes were in autumn. "Well," said Lopatin, "is the wedding going to be soon?" "It won't be long," said Novikov. "There's sure to be a wedding if there are Katyushas around," said Majid. Majid was convinced that the rocket launchers would play a decisive role. After a glass of vodka, he became condescending, sarcastic, sceptical, and distant, and Novikov took a strong dislike to him. Now, whenever he met people, Novikov tried to imagine what Yevgenia Nikolaevna would think of them. He also tried to imagine how they would behave with her, and what they would find to talk about. Majid, he decided, would at once start to flirt, putting on airs, boasting, and telling all tall stories. He suddenly felt anxious and jealous, as though Xenia really was listening to Majid's witticisms. Wanting to make an impression on her himself, he began to explain how important it is to understand the men you're fighting alongside, to know in advance how they're likely to behave in battle. He talked about Karpov, who would need egging on, about Bailov, who would need holding back, and about Makarov, who was equally at home in attack and in defence. A series of rather empty remarks, as often happens with a group of officers representing different arms of the service, gave rise to a heated but equally empty argument. "Yes," said Morozov, "sometimes you need to correct people a little, to give them some kind of orientation, but you should never impose your will on them." "Oh, people should be led firmly," said Neudobnov. "One should never be afraid of taking responsibility on oneself." Lopatin changed the subject. "If you haven't fought in Stalingrad, then you haven't seen war." "Excuse me," exclaimed Majid, "but why Stalingrad? No one could deny the stubbornness and heroism of its defenders. That would be absurd, but I've never been in Stalingrad, and I still have the cheek to say that I have seen war. My element is the offensive. I've taken part in 3 offensives. And let me tell you something. I've been the one who've broken through the enemy line. I've been the one who's entered the breach. Yeah, the artillery really showed what it can do. We were ahead of the infantry, ahead of the tanks, we were even ahead of the air force." "Come on now," said Novikov fiercely. "Everyone knows that the tank is the master of mobile warfare. That's something there can be no 2 opinions about." "There's one other possibility," said Lopatin, taking up an earlier thread of the conversation. "In the event of success, you can take the credit yourself. But if you fail, you can blame it on your neighbours." "Don't talk to me of neighbours," said Morozov. "There was this general, the commander of an infantry unit, who asked for a supporting barrage. Go on, old man, just give those heights a little dusting for me. I asked him what calibers I should use. He called me every name in the book and repeated, 'Open fire! Don't waste time about it!' I discovered afterwards he couldn't tell one caliber from another, had no idea of the different ranges, could hardly even read a map. 'Open fire, you motherfucker!' and he'd shout out to his subordinates, 'Forward, or I'll smash your teeth in! Forward, or I'll put you against the wall and have you shot!' And of course, he was convinced he was a great strategist. There's a fine neighbour for you. And often you end up being put under someone like that. After all, he was a general." "I'm surprised to hear you talking like that," said Neudobnov. "There are no officers like that in the Soviet armed forces, and certainly no generals." "What do you mean?" asked Morozov. "I've met hundreds over the last year. They curse, wave their pistols about, expose their men to enemy fire just for the fun of it. Why, not long ago I saw a battalion commander burst out crying. 'How can I lead my men straight into those machine guns?' he said. 'Don't worry,' I told him. 'First let's neutralise those gun emplacements. The artillery can do that.' And what do you think the general in command of the division did? He went for the battalion commander with his fists. 'Either you attack right now,' he shouted, 'or I'll have you shot like a dog.' So he led his men forward to be slaughtered." "Yes," said Majid, "I'll do as I please, and don't you dare contradict me. That's their motto, and these generals don't, incidentally, propagate themselves just by budding. They get their dirty hands on pretty little telephonists." "And they can't write 2 words without making 5 mistakes," said Lopatin. "That's just it," said Morozov, who hadn't heard this last remark. "Try sparing your men with people like that around. They don't care about their men. That's the only strength they have." Novikov sympathised with everything Morozov had said. He had seen all too many incidents like that himself, and yet he suddenly blurted out, "Spare your men? How do you think you can spare your men? If that's what you want, then you've got no business to be fighting." Those young recruits had upset him. He wanted to talk about them, but Instead of letting the officers see his true kindness, he burst out with a violence that surprised even himself. "Spare your men, indeed! You don't spare your men in war any more than you spare yourself. I'll tell you what upsets me. It's when we have to entrust precious equipment to a bunch of greenhorns. And then I wonder, is it really men we need to be so careful of?" Udobnov himself had been responsible for the death of more than one man, similar to those who were now sitting at table. And Novikov suddenly thought that this man was no less of a danger than the enemy front line. Udobnov had been watching Novikov and Morozov as they spoke. Now he said sententiously, "That's not what Comrade Stalin says. Comrade Stalin tells us that nothing is more precious than men. Our men, our cadres, are the most precious capital of all. One must watch over them like the apple of one's eye." Sensing that everyone agreed with Udobnov, Novikov thought, "How strange. Now they all think of me as a brute, and Udobnov as someone who looks after his men. A pity Getmanov isn't here. He's even more of a saint." He broke in on Udobnov's homily and barked out even more fiercely, "We've got more than enough men. What we don't have is equipment. Any idiot can make a man. It's another matter to make a tank or a plane. If you're so sorry for your men, then you've no business to call yourself an officer." Lieutenant General Yeremenko, the commander-in-chief of the Stalingrad front, had summoned Novikov, Getmanov, and Udobnov for an interview. He had inspected the individual brigades on the previous day, but hadn't called at Corps HQ. The three of them sat in his bunker, glancing now again at Yeremenko as they wondered what was in store for them. Yeremenko noticed Getmanov looking at the crumpled pillow on the bunk. "Yes, my leg's very sore." They watched Yeremenko in silence, while he cursed his bad leg. "Your corps seems well prepared. You seem to have made good use of the time." He looked at Novikov as he said this, a little surprised at the corps commander's apparent indifference to the compliment. He knew he was considered grudging in his praise for subordinates. "Comrade Lieutenant General," said Novikov, "I've already reported to you that our ground support aircraft have twice bombed the 137th Tank Brigade in the area of the ravines. That brigade forms part of my corps." Narrowing his eyes, Yeremenko wondered what Novikov was after. Did he have it in for the officer responsible, or was he just trying to cover himself? Novikov frowned and added, "It's a good thing there weren't any direct hits. They haven't yet learnt their trade." "Oh, very well," said Yeremenko, "but you'll be glad of their support later. You can be sure they'll make up for their error." "Of course, comrade, Commander-in-Chief," Getmanov joined in. "We've no intention of picking a quarrel with Stalin's Air Force." "That's right, Comrade Getmanov," said Yeremenko. "Well, have you seen Khrushchev?" "Nikita Sergeyevich has ordered me to visit him tomorrow." "You know each other from Kiev, don't you?" "Yes, I worked with Nikita Sergeyevich for nearly 2 years." "Tell me, Comrade General," said Yeremenko, turning to Udobnov, "did I once see you at Titian Petrovich's?" "Oh, that's right," said Udobnov. "That was when he had called you up, together with Marshal Voronov." "Oh, yes, I remember." "And I, at Titian Petrovich's request, was temporarily serving in the capacity of People's Commissar. That's why I was there." "So we've met before," said Yeremenko. "Well, I hope you're not bored in the steppes, Comrade General. Have you managed to make yourself comfortable?" Without waiting for an answer, he gave a satisfied nod of the head. As the three men were going out of the door, Yeremenko called out, "One moment, Colonel." Novikov went back into the room. Yeremenko half got up, leaning his stout peasant body over the desk, and said, "So there we are. One of them's worked with Khrushchev, and the other with Titian Petrovich. But don't you forget, you damned son of a bitch, you're the soldier. You're the one who's going to lead your tank corps into the breach." Krimov was released from hospital on a cold, dark morning. Without even going home, he went straight to General Toscheyev, the head of the political administration of the front, to report on his visit to Stalingrad. and Krimov was in luck. Toshchev had been in his office, a small hut faced with grey planks, since early morning. He received his visitor without delay. Toshchev, squinting constantly at his brand-new general's uniform, turned up his nose at the smell of carbolic acid that emanated from his visitor. "After being wounded," said Krimov, "I was unable to complete my mission to House 6-1. I can go back there straight away." Toshchev gave him an irritated look. "No, just write me a detailed report." Toshchev didn't ask a single question, nor did he utter one word of approval or disapproval. As always, a general's uniform and medals seemed out of place in a simple village hut. But that wasn't the only thing that was odd. Krimov was unable to understand why the general should seem so sullen and dissatisfied. He went into the administrative section to obtain lunch coupons, to register his rations certificate, and to sort out various formalities to do with his mission and the days he'd spent in hospital. And while this was being attended to, he sat on a stool and studied the faces of the people in the office. No one showed the least interest in him. His visit to Stalingrad, his wound, all he had seen and done seemed quite without meaning. The people here had work to get on with. Typewriters clattered, papers rustled, people's eyes slid rapidly over Krimov before returning to the sheaves of paper spread out over their desks. What a lot of furrowed brows! What tension in everyone's eyes! How absorbed they all seemed in their work! How quickly and deftly their fingers leafed through the papers! Only the odd convulsive yawn or furtive glance at the clock, only a bleary, haggard look that appeared fleetingly on one face or another, spoke of the deadly boredom of this stuffy office. Someone Krimov knew, an instructor from the 7th Department, looked in through the door. Krimov went out into the corridor with him for a smoke. "So you're back, are you?" "As you see," said Krimov. As the instructor didn't ask anything about Stalingrad, Krimov asked, "So what's new in the political administration?" The main piece of news was that Brigade Commissar Toshchev had finally, under the new system to which they were changing over, been given the rank of general. The instructor laughed as he told Krimov how Toshchev had fallen ill with anxiety. He'd had a general's uniform made up for him by the best tailor at the front, and then Moscow kept delaying the announcement. It hadn't been at all funny. There were dark rumours that, under this new system, some of the regimental commissars and senior battalion commissars would only be given the ranks of captain or senior lieutenant. "Just imagine," said the instructor, "after 8 years in the army political organs, to be made a lieutenant." There were other items of news. The deputy head of the information section had been summoned to Moscow. There he'd been promoted to deputy head of the political administration of the Kalinin Front. The member of the military soviet had decreed that senior instructors were now to eat in the general canteen rather than in the canteen for heads of sections. Instructors sent on missions were to have their meal tickets withdrawn without any compensatory issue of field rations. The poets Katz and Talalayevsky had been put forward for the Red Star Medal. But according to Comrade Sherbakov's new decree, awards to members of the press had to be approved by the Central Political Administration. The poets' dossiers had been sent to Moscow. Meanwhile, Yeremenko had signed the list of soldiers to be decorated. Everyone except the poets was already celebrating. "Have you had lunch yet?" asked the instructor. "Come on, then." Krimov said he was waiting for his documents. "Well, I'm off," said the instructor. "There's no time to lose." He added with a trace of irony, "Soon we'll be eating in the canteen for civilian workers and typists." Krimov got his documents back and went outside, took a deep breath of the damp autumn air. Why had the head of the political administration received him so coldly? Why did he seem so annoyed? Because Krimov hadn't completed his mission? Did he suspect him of cowardice? Did he doubt that he really had been wounded? Or was Toshchev annoyed that Krimov had come straight to him without first seeing his own immediate superior, and at a time when he didn't usually receive visitors? Or was it that Krimov had twice called him Comrade Brigade Commissar instead of Comrade Major General? Or maybe it wasn't anything to do with Krimov. Maybe he had a letter saying his wife had fallen ill. Perhaps he'd hoped to be put forward for the order of Kutuzov. There were, after all, any number of reasons why he might be in a bad mood. During his weeks in Stalingrad, Krimov had forgotten what it was like in Akhtuba. He'd forgotten the way of your superiors, your colleagues. Even the waitresses in the canteen looked at you as if you barely existed. In the evening he went back to his room. The landlady's dog was very glad to see him. It seemed to be made up of two halves, a shaggy reddish-brown behind and a long black and white face, and both halves were equally welcoming. The shaggy brown tail wagged, and the black and white face thrust itself into Krimov's hands, looking at him tenderly with its brown eyes. In the twilight it seemed that there were two dogs, both of them making up to Krimov. The dog came with him as far as the door, and then the landlady appeared and shouted, "Get out of it, you filthy creature!" Only then did she greet Krimov, and her welcome was as sullen as Toshcheyev's. His quiet little room seemed very lonely after the friendly warmth of the trenches, the grey, smoky, tarpaulin-covered bunkers that were like the lairs of animals. The bed itself, the pillow in its white pillowcase, and the lace curtains all seemed equally unwelcoming. Krimov sat down and started to compile his report. He wrote quickly, glancing only briefly at the notes he had made in Stalingrad. The most difficult part was House 6-1. He got up, walked about the room and sat down. Then he got up again, went out into the corridor and coughed. Surely that damn woman would offer him some tea. Oh, instead he ladled out some water from the barrel. It was very pleasant, better than the water in Stalingrad. He went back to his room and sat down for a while to think, pen in hand. Then he lay down on the bed and closed his eyes. How had it happened? Grekov had fired at him. In Stalingrad, he had felt a rapport with the men around him. He'd been at ease there. People had no longer looked at him with blank indifference. In House 6-1, he'd expected to feel the spirit of Lenin still more strongly. Instead, he'd immediately encountered mockery and hostility. He'd lost his poise, began lecturing people, making threats. What could have made him talk about Suvorov? And then Grekov had shot at him. Today, his isolation, the condescending arrogance people whom he thought of as semi-literates, as mere greenhorns in the party, had been more distressing than ever. Why should he have to bow and scrape before a man like Toshcheyev? What right did Toshcheyev have to look at him with such disdain and ill humour? In terms of the work he'd done for the party, he couldn't hold a candle to Krimov, for all his medals and high rank. What did people like him have to do with the party and the Leninist tradition? Many of them had come to the fore only in 1937, by writing denunciations and unmasking enemies of the people. And then Krimov remembered the wonderful sense of faith, strength, and light-heartedness he'd felt as he walked down the underground passage towards that tiny point of daylight. He felt choked with anger. Grekov had exiled him from the life he yearned for. On his way to the building, he had been joyfully conscious of a new turn in his destiny. He had believed that the spirit of Lenin was alive there. And then Grekov had fired at a Leninist, at an old Bolshevik. He had sent Krimov back to the stifling offices of Akhtuba. The swine! Krimov sat down. Every word he then wrote was the absolute truth. He read the report over. Toshcheyev, of course, would pass it on to the special department. Grekov had subverted and demoralized the military subunit under his command. He had committed an act of terrorism. He had fired at a representative of the party, a military commissar. Krimov would have to give evidence. Probably he'd be summoned for a personal confrontation with Grekov, who by then would have been arrested. He imagined Grekov in front of the investigator's desk, unshaven, without his belt, his face pale and yellow. What was it Grekov had said? "But you've suffered a lot." The Secretary-General of the party of Marx and Lenin had been declared infallible, almost divine, and he certainly hadn't spared the old Bolsheviks in 1937. He had infringed the very spirit of Leninism, that fusion of party democracy and iron discipline. How could Stalin have settled accounts so ruthlessly with members of Lenin's own party? Grekov would be shot in front of the ranks. It was terrible to kill one's own men. But then Grekov was an enemy. Krimov had never doubted the sacred right of the revolution to destroy its enemies. The party had a right to wield the sword of dictatorship. He had never been one to sympathize with the opposition. He had never believed that Bukharin, Rykov, Zinoviev, Kamenev were true followers of Lenin, and Trotsky, for all his brilliance and revolutionary fervour, had never outlived his Menshevik past. He had never attained the stature of Lenin. Stalin, though, was a man of true strength. It wasn't for nothing he was known as the boss. His hand had never trembled. He had none of Bukharin's flabby intellectuality. Crushing its enemies underfoot, the party of Lenin now followed Stalin. Grekov's military competence was of no significance. There was no point in listening to one's enemies, no point in arguing with them. It was no good. Krimov could no longer bring himself to feel angry with Grekov. Once again he remembered those words of Grekov's. But you've suffered a lot. Have I gone and written a denunciation? Krimov asked himself. All right, it may be true, but that doesn't make it any the less a denunciation. But what can you do about it, comrade? You're a member of the party. You must do your duty. The following morning, Krimov handed in his report. 2 days later, he was summoned by Regimental Commissar Ogibalov, the head of the Agitprop section, who was acting for the head of the political administration. Toshchev himself was busy with the commissar of a tank corps and was unable to see Krimov. Ogibalov was a slow, methodical man with a pale face and a large nose. In a few days, we're sending you off to the right bank, Comrade Krimov, he said. This time you'll be going to Shumilov's, the 64th Army. One of our cars will be going to the command post of the Obkom. From there, you can get across to Shumilov's yourself. The Obkom secretaries are going to Bekatovka to celebrate the anniversary of the revolution. Very slowly he dictated Krimov's instructions. The tasks he had been assigned were humiliatingly boring and trivial, of no importance except for official records. What about my lecture? Asked Krimov. At your request I prepare a lecture to be read to the different units during the October celebrations. Oh, we'll have to leave that for the moment, said Ogibalov, and went on to explain the reasons for this decision. As Krimov was getting up to leave, the commissar said, As for that report of yours, well, my boss has just put me in the picture. Krimov's heart sank. So the wheels were already turning. Our brave warrior's been lucky, the commissar went on. We were informed yesterday by the head of the political section of the 62nd Army that Grekov, together with all his men, was killed during the German assault on the tractor factory. As though to console Krimov, he added, The army commander nominated him posthumously for the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, and we'll certainly squash that. Krimov shrugged his shoulders as if to say, So he's had a stroke of luck. Well, that's that. Ogibalov lowered his voice. The head of the special section thinks he may still be alive. He may have gone over to the enemy. Krimov found a note waiting for him at home. He was to report to the special section. So the Grekov affair wasn't yet over and done with. Krimov decided to postpone what was bound to be a very disagreeable conversation until his return. After all, a posthumous affair could hardly be so very urgent.